Hey everyone, I'm Sierra, and this video is going to be about how I edit on Lightroom. I love using Lightroom for all of my social media feeds, but most importantly, I just love using them to edit my photos and just make them look as polished and as aesthetically pleasing for me as I can. This video is going to be an in-depth look on the basics of Lightroom and just how to get your photos to the aesthetic you want it to be. My instructions aren't hard-lined, but they're just guidelines for you to follow in case you're new to Lightroom or just have been using Lightroom for a bit but just want to get some more in-depth info on how to edit on Lightroom. So I hope you enjoy. So I've opened Lightroom on my computer, and as we can see over here, here are my albums. So we'll come into this English project and we can see this toolbar over here. What we'll really be talking about today is the editing portion. This is where most everything happens in Lightroom that will change this photo into a photo I would love to post on my social media. This alone is really good. I look bronzed and youthful and healthy. This was taken in the summer while I was in Vancouver, and I really like this photo, but I'd like to touch it up a bit to make it fit my aesthetic just a little bit more. So as we can see, this is the editing portion, and we'll come into our we'll walk through everything. So if we're coming in, we can see that we have our exposures, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, and we'll get into those a little bit later about what will happen. This is our point curve, also known as an S-curve, that is really fundamental in using Lightroom, and not a lot of people know what to do with it, which is something we'll be going over today. We have tabs right here in our color that allow us to affect the temperature, the tint, vibrance, and saturation of our photo to really make it what we want it to be. Furthermore, we can specifically adjust colors in Lightroom, which makes it really awesome. We have our effects, which give us texture, clarity, and even more tools that we can use. And something I really like is our geometry feature. This allows us to really affect how the camera took this photo, which is something you don't get a lot in other programming and software apps like Visco and Pixar. So if we come back up to our lights, we can see that this photo is a little bright. My shirt really stands out. So I kind of want to desaturate that a little bit. And the key with doing Lightroom is really just allowing yourself to play around. So if we look, we can see that if we go to the extremes, we see some pretty heavy extremes. So we're going to lower the exposure just a tad. And when I mean a tad, I mean just a tad. So kind of right here seems pretty good. And we're actually going to bump up the contrast. I really like contrast in photos. It brings the person in focus into the foreground. So we'll just do it a little bit. This right here just really makes me be more of the focal point of the photo. We're also going to bump up the highlights actually, which is going to be pretty interesting because we'll also be bumping up our shadows, but only slightly. This just kind of allows for the high points of my face, so like my cheekbones, and some of the highlights in the background to just be a little bit more vibrant, but not necessarily bright. And for the shadows, because it is a little dark in the back, we're going to come in and we're going to bump these up just to make it look like the photo was taken more in the middle of the day versus in the evening time which it was. Furthermore, we're going to lower my whites. This is because they're just a little too vibrant for me, so I just kind of want to lower them down and make them on more of a natural white than something that's very overexposed in light, when in reality the shirt isn't, it's more of a cream color than a white. And we're also going to lower the blacks. This is going to affect these focal points back here in the photo, more so in the background than me myself. And we're only going to do that a little bit less than the whites, and we can see how that changes the photo just a bit. So we're going to come into this point curve, and it is super important that we know what's going on. So this right here is our shadows, this midpoint here is our darks, these are our midtones, these are our lights, and these are our highlights. So we're going to adjust these just a bit by coming up. So when we come up, what we're doing is we're brightening up those shadows. And I'm really only going to have this come just a little bit above the line since we did that here. These affect the picture differently, as these are just sliding scales, where these are pinpointing exact points of the photo to affect. Then I'm going to come up to my darks, and my darks are more associated with me versus the background. So our shadows are looking at our foreground, whereas the darks are looking at me. What's really on my skin? How is the sun affecting me, or the light in this instance affecting me? So we're going to take this just a tad, and we're just going to bump it up just a little bit. Nothing too dramatic. And then we're going to come here with our midtones, and we're going to just bring them down just a tad. This allows us to still maintain that contrast and also not allow a picture to be so neutral, if that makes sense. So then we'll come into our lights, and we're also going to bring this down just a tad here. So if we look at our lights, it's really affecting that key point of my skin. And so if we just bring those down, it allows just this portion that's being hit by the sun to really be in tone with the rest of the photo. And then, because I can see what I've done has affected this white portion of my shirt, we're going to bring down those highlights too, just to allow for everything to just be a little bit more in balance. And I can see that it's still a little too extreme, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to try to bump these up just a tad so it's not too dramatic. Okay, so I like how that looks, and if we just take a look down here, we can look at our original photo and show the original. Wow, it's really overexposed, it's really bright, but here I've kind of toned it down and allowed it to look a little bit more neutral. So once we're done with our lights, after playing around with that, we're going to come down into our colors. So if we come into our temperature, we can see that the temperature can be either really warm or really cool. So what I'm actually going to do is I want this to be just a little bit warm, just so one, I have that youthful glow to myself, but also to the foliage in the back, so it just looks like a really summertime photo. And that's something I really like in my pictures. I want the yellow in my skin to really be brought out, but to a point where it's not, I don't look yellow. And tint, I don't want this to be too green or too purpley red. So what I'm going to do is actually just bump up this just a little bit as well, actually similar to our temperature, so that it's still warm, it's still summertime, but it kind of also brings away the green in the photo. Because there's so much green, I have to counteract that, because if I bump up my greens, it's actually putting more focus into the background versus me myself. But what I also want to do is I'll play with the saturation to make the colors seem that they're really apparent, really lively, and once again, very youthful. However, sometimes that can be just a little bit too much for the eye. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower that vibrance of it, make them not as bright. Color payoff is still there, but it is really important. So then we'll come down into our color mixer and we'll see what the reds do. So for the reds, you can see that they really are affecting my skin. And like I said, I love myself to look a little bit more warm, so we'll just bump that up just a tad, barely noticeable. And we're actually going to saturate this just a little bit more than we did previously in our tints, but it really gives me that pink undertone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump down that luminance a little bit, and this allows it to balance itself out, but I still look very warm, even though we've kind of affected the vibrance of everything. Then we're going to come into the orange, and if we look at the orange, we see that this is really affecting my skin. So what we're going to do is we're really just going to touch this up just a tad to be on par with the red, still give me that warm color payoff, and we're actually going to desaturate it just a little bit, like barely noticeable, just for the effect of keeping it in balance. And we're not going to adjust this luminance because I actually want the orange to stand out more than the red. Then we'll come into the yellows, and when we look at the yellows, you see that it's actually affecting the foliage more than it's affecting myself. So I'll let this, I'm actually going to change the hue of this just a little bit to be more like green sign, since we see it's affecting the foliage more. And we're going to bump up the saturation because I really love the look of saturation in my photos and that color payoff, but I don't want the green to be as distracting. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower this luminance to about 27, just so the green can just kind of fall more into the background. And this one, because it's really affecting the actual green instead of the undertones of the green, we're actually going to leave the hue off, but we're going to desaturate this just a little bit more, just so then I'm really the focus of the photo, which is something I really want. And I'm also going to bump down that luminance, and we can see that that can either make it really dark green or really bright green, but because I want this to be a little bit darker to also aid in that contrast with myself being exposed, we're just gonna bump that down just a little bit. And if we look at our originals, we're really seeing the difference that this makes. We can also see that there aren't really any blues or purples in this photo, so I'm actually gonna leave those alone, just because they wouldn't really be affecting much. So we'll come down into our effects, and texture, clarity, dehazing, these are all really great if we want to add, instead of making this more of a DSLR look, which is very polished, very headshot-like, we can use these to just really add into almost making it look more film-esque. So something I'm going to do is actually bump up this texture, and this will texturize my skin, texturize the photo, make it more lifelike versus polished. But I'm also going to bump up my clarity so that the overall look of the photo isn't too grainy or oversaturated. However, we will bump up the grain just a little bit to aid in it looking more like it was taken on a film camera versus a DSLR. Your details can add to it, especially if you've taken a photo that's a little bit shaky, by sharpening the image, but if I sharpen it, it just looks so hyper realistic, so I kind of leave that alone. Noise reduction and color reduction really are useful if photos are taken in city areas, but I like to leave those alone just because I'm just the singular person in this photo. Optics can be used when dealing with iPhones, since camera phones warp the way a photo is taken more so than an actual camera, so you can adjust those if you'd like, but I just love to leave those alone. And if we come into our geometry, we can see that we can distort the photo. This is something I really like, especially for someone that's a little bit shorter, and when the photo is taken as close as this, I like to almost give myself, instead of making it look more of a headshot, I'll actually come in and I will adjust the distortion like so. So I look like it was taken a little bit further away, so I'm not so directly and taking up so much space. But also, I'm going to up my vertical lens because it will also make me look just a little bit taller, but just slightly, not too much. And something you want to do is constrain crop this there so you don't get those funky edges. And if we look back at our original, we can see I was actually really a lot in the foreground and overexposed, and it just really gives me that grained aesthetic that I really enjoy. Hey everyone, so I hope you enjoyed those instructions. Just to reiterate, these instructions are not something that you have to follow. These are just guidelines to get you more comfortable with Lightroom and more comfortable with using the tools so that you can create and curate your own aesthetics so that your social media feeds will be how you want them to be. I hope that this was informative, and if you have any more questions on how to use Lightroom, please leave anything in the comments, contact me with my information in the info box, and I'd be sure to help you out. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed.